Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, enjoy a vibrant discussion with Bob Cryer, son of comedy legend Barry Cryer, as he tells anecdotes of his father's incredible life and career from his new book, Barry Cryer, Same Time Tomorrow, including the story of how Cryer called up his literary hero, J.B Priestley, and went over for tea with the Monty Python troupe. Recorded live at the 2024 Bradford Literature Festival, Cryer is joined by Steve Abbott, manager-turned-producer for Monty Python, and Lindsay Sutton, chair of the J.B Priestley Society.
I think we kick off, as we say at Valley Parade.
Hello, Glastonbury.
By the way, did you see Coldplay last night? Unbelievable spectacle. It was wonderful at night. Yeah.
They're still going on, aren't they?
They are. Quite remarkable. Yeah. I just want to say as well that we Steve and myself went to the dinner kicking off at the Midland Hotel that kicked it off, and Lem Sissay was opening the festival. Lem Sissay, poet, Manchester-based, and he was scintillating. I've never known a guy get an audience so much of in the palm of his hand. Self-effacing, very critical, and he showed the difference between him 21 years ago and 21 now. And I said to the person next to me, Barry Cryer's like that, you know. He's magic. He could bring people together. And, you know, although you'd expect him to be full of himself, he wasn't. He was full of material. That's the point. Full of opportunities and material. And you were made welcome and relaxed from the beginning. I'm really envious of this guy, you know. I only saw him every now and again, and so did Steve. But it must have been, I'm going to introduce him later, but I want to just tell everyone that why have we all come together today with an air of expectancy? Well, it's Barry Cryer. He's the link. He is the link man between, you know, we're expecting to find out this expectancy. What is the link between a great figure in the world of comedy and entertainment, a great figure in literature and the stage, our very own, and the zany madhouse world of Monty Python? And that link was Barry Cryer. And we're going to explain how that all came about and how it developed. We must pay testimony because it's the late Barry Cryer. He died January 25th, 2022. And the outpouring of love, affection, and memories was massive, as you are going to tell us, Bob, I think. But typically, one of his last jokes was, I must stop buying green bananas. And that is typically Barry. That is a superb joke, you know, of a man who's getting on 88 and wondering what's round the corner. But he was a Yorkshire boy, was Barry, and his spirit lives on. Not just through his son, but through a myriad of people. And you're going to tell about Miriam Margolis, aren't you?
Even yesterday.
She was nearly in tears talking about him. Quite remarkable yesterday. So here with us now is son Bob. And
hello.
I think, yes, indeed, opportunities later to have him sign the book. And we've both read it, Steve and myself, and it's a showstopper. It is really good insight and not stuffy, but what you'd expect from a good Yorkshire boy as well. It is all there, and it's scintillating stuff, and not show-off. It's just your dad, isn't it? So this is Bob, who himself, by the way, is an accomplished writer, actor in his own right. I'll go into that later. And he's going to give us an insight into Barry, his wife Terry, who was very important in Barry's life. Behind every great man is a great woman. And the family.
Without whom I wouldn't be here.
Indeed, indeed. And the family, and Barry's contribution, and then, crucially, that link with the Pythons. So Steve Abbott is going to help us fill in that little gap later. Yeah. Now, Steve Abbott, of course, Bradford lad, accountant, manager, film producer, office in LA, Well, it doesn't
In
get
that
much
order.
better from Barker. Yeah, from Barker End Road to LA. It's pretty good, isn't it? And he was a producer of the Pythons films. Has a close connection with one Python in particular. Another Yorkshireman, of course, Michael Palin. They're bosom buddies, but he also acts for him managerially. And he'll give us an insight and the inside track into the world of these great creative spirits. That must have been a heck of a job to manage them, but
Unmanageable. It's like herding
unmanageable. Yeah. So basically, that's who we're dealing with. But we'll go with Barry Cryer first. He told me a joke. Again, I'm not going to give you a litany of jokes, but Bob can. But the Archbishop joke, and it was quite late on in his career, and he said, "Have you heard the one about the Archbishop?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, there was this couple standing at the side of the road, waiting for a bus. And his wife said, 'You see that guy over there? I think it's the Archbishop of Canterbury.' She said, 'Go across and ask him.' So he does. He goes across and he has a conversation and he comes back. And she said, 'What did he say?' He said, 'He told me to F off.' She said, 'That's very disappointing. Now we'll never know.'" Brilliant joke. It's a brilliant joke. So as you know, Barry was a scriptwriter, and when I say scriptwriter, to the greats, the list is endless. We're talking even the American, you can go into that.
Yeah.
Bob Hope, was it Benny Goodman?
Jack Benny.
Jack Benny, yeah. Amazing litany of people he wrote for. And in this country, every single person that moves, from Les Dawson, Morecambe and Wise, and you fill us in with just the scope and the range. Bob is going to let us know, and I'm going to ask him, by the way, was it a bit difficult sometimes to have such a luminary father? Was it overawing? But you can come back to that
We can come
later.
back to that.
Yeah, because it must have been
Ask my therapist.
difficult. Yeah, yes, indeed. You're the youngest child, aren't you?
I am.
Yeah, very keen sportsman, as we are, Yorkshire cricket and Bradford City, Steve and my loves. Barry married a dancer and a singer, Terry. They were married for 60 years.
Nearly.
Yeah.
Very sadly, didn't quite make. They were together for 60 years, married for 59.
That's amazing, isn't it? Yeah. And she was,
If he'd hurried up with the proposal, they would have made it. But, yeah.
Absolutely. I know that he told Bob at one time, we were talking about the children, and he said, "I tell them to take the work seriously, but don't take yourself seriously." That's pretty good advice from a dad, isn't it? His advice, I think, to you was, if I've got it right, life's not fair, but don't be late.
I can't actually attribute that to Dad, sadly.
Right.
That's from a book of theatrical anecdotes.
Is it?
By a writer whose name escapes me, and hopefully neither himself nor his agent are in today. But yeah, that was one actor to another, saying it's not fair and don't be late.
Yeah, it's a good one, isn't it?
That's evenly balanced with, take the work seriously, but don't take yourself seriously. I think they've both got a similar message.
They have, and it's nice to give to a son, isn't it?
Yeah.
And family. I think all of us know Barry from I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue, which became an absolute staple. And I think that was 50 years. It became a household name, known and respected throughout the profession, acting, writing, scripting, stage. And he very quickly realised, I think, his strengths, didn't he?
On that show,
Yeah.
it's the only job growing up that Dad never really talked about much, because it was like wearing gloves. It fitted him so well, that spirit of anarchy. He said, "I love it when everything's falling apart." That's when Dad, something he had in common with the Pythons as well, that spirit of professional amateurism that I think pervaded all of their work, which is, Clue was a very good example of that. And in fact also started with another Python, with John Cleese, by John Cleese turning it down, essentially. Because I don't know if you remember I'm Sorry, I'll Read That Again, which was the scripted forerunner of that show. And Graham Garden wanted to do another show, but one without the heavily scripted preparation for it, and asked Bill Oddie and John Cleese if they'd like to do it, and scared them to death. They're both very controlling individuals of their oeuvre, brilliantly so in both cases. But they needed to have a script, they needed to have a through line, whereas Graham wanted something, a bit extemporary.
And it's true, because as Michael's agent and manager to this day, 45 years on, he turns down every request to go on a panel show or game show where there be improv.
For that reason.
For that reason.
Yeah, and yet Dad managed to get him on Joker's Wild. John Cleese.
Yeah. Up in Leeds.
Yeah, exactly. And that was very much against sort of the spirit of what John had said about I'm sorry I haven't a clue. But he also needed an angle. So he played the sort of disinterested, serious actor in the corner, reading a book at one stage on Joker's Wild. And Dad was said, Mr. Cleese, am I interrupting you? Is everything okay? This is on television.
Yeah.
It's remarkable, isn't it, that? And yet this all started off, right? Barry Cryer, Leeds, not a gilded spoon background, goes to Leeds University. Jacks it in, I think, quite quickly, doesn't he?
I think Leeds University might have jacked him in. I think that was... he said, I'm BA English failed.
He used to say that,
Leeds University.
Yeah.
He spent most of his first year in the bar and chasing girls and occasionally doing a bit of singing and comedy. And University Road, which is right down the middle of imaginatively named University Road, between the social and the academic. And Dad said he rarely crossed the road at all in that time and failed his first year exams, but he also got a gig as a stand-up at the City Varieties almost in the same week. So he said, my fate was sealed.
Isn't that amazing? And he was in the RAG, the students' RAG.
RAG Review, yeah.
And the Bradford Telegraph and Argus gave him his first big lift, didn't it?
Yeah, that's the first review.
Yeah, and it extolled his This Is One to Watch.
Yeah.
And that's pretty good coming from Bradford for a boy from Leeds. Yeah.
Dad could have retired then.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And he went to London to ply his trade, Barry. And the Windmill Theatre in those days, it was nude tableau for men in the daytime. And he was the gagster in the middle of these things. And he always said he started at the bottom, didn't he?
There wasn't actually a bill at the Windmill. There was, sort of two separate halves, and there was a comedian in each half. But Dad always said the better line was to say, I started at the bottom. And Bruce Forsyth was at the top. But Mrs. Henderson Presents, the movie about the Windmill. So for any of you unfamiliar of that milieu, it's Judi Dench running the show with Bob Hoskins as the erstwhile impresario theatre manager Vivian Van Dam, or VD as he was known to the comics, who Dad auditioned for. Shall I tell that story?
Yes, why not? That's a good one.
The Windmill, I need to scroll back slightly to Leeds and the City Varieties again, with Dad's first professional gig, that his mother, my grandmother, Jenny, who in all senses of the term was the stereotypical dour Yorkshire housewife, albeit for the fact that she was actually from Cumbria. And so she let the side down on that front. But she wasn't, she was known as the Mute by my sister. She's a very taciturn woman with a very immovable face. Until one afternoon, she took my dad to the Leeds Empire. And it was... oh gosh, I've forgotten his name. Cheeky chappy, Cockney comedian, Max Miller,
yeah.
Who very rarely actually performed in the North or Scotland. He said to his agent once, he said, I'm a comedian, not a missionary. And Dad said his mum took him along to see that and said that was the first time, and he was only sort of 13 or 14, she saw a twinkle in her eye. And I sort of psychoanalyze that a little bit, as much as Dad would let me from behind the curtain, because he wouldn't have approved of that kind of analysis in this book, to say that he'd been chasing that twinkle ever since, which is what made him become a comedian. So it sort of set him on a path. And when he was at the City Varieties, which again was a nude tableau, a nude review, he thought, well, I'll tell my mother, but I won't, invite her to come along. And then, third night that he was performing there, she hadn't said anything. Fourth night, she hadn't asked him how it went. He thought, well, she's being quite prudish. And he came in to work the next day and said, was that your mother last night? He said, was what my mother last night? He said, this lady came in with a rain hat and a raincoat and said, what time's Barry Cryer on? And she said, are you Mrs. Cryer? And she sort of didn't answer. She said, the woman at the box office recognised she was. He said, come in. She said, I'll pay for my tickets. No, it's on us. He said, here's a seat for you. She said, no, I don't want to sit. She stood at the back of the stalls, watched Dad's act. Then he finished, and then she disappeared into the night. And she didn't mention this at all. And on the Saturday, Dad thought, I've got to confront her about this. So he's washing up after their tea, and he says, you came in to see me in the week, didn't you? She went, yes, I did. And he said, well, what did you think? He said, the suit was nice. So he knew that his, prudish Yorkshire housewife mother wouldn't have disapproved too much when he found himself in London on day 16 of a 17-day return to London, which was set up by David Nixon. I don't know if you remember him, the magician who was appearing at the Leeds Empire, where Dad was working backstage at the time as his sort of confidant and dresser and stage manager for a while. A very unfortunate story with David Nixon. Always came to jobs with his wife, and she would be in the dressing room and helping him out. They usually drove up in the same car, but for whatever reason, David had a prior engagement, so he came up separately, and she died in a car accident on the way up to see him in Leeds. And it sort of set the tone for Dad. I'd be relevant about this. It seems quite a mawkish thing to introduce at such a celebratory occasion. But Dad was charged with David's well-being because, like the old pro that he was, David Nixon says, well, I'm not going to cancel the job. She would have wanted me to have taken the work, which is something Dad always said. And he saw the kindness that he paid David Nixon returned, because David Nixon said, well, I know you're a stage manager and you've done a wonderful job with me as my dresser, but I know you've got aspirations to be a comic. He said, well, here's 5 business cards of managers and producers. I've got you set up with meetings in the West End. Get yourself down to London, son, and make a go of it. And on day 16, he's at the Windmill Theatre, the famous Windmill Theatre, who had Revue de Ville, as you said, which Vivian Van Damme got round. The Lord Chamberlain, as it was, who threatened to ban any sort of lewd behaviour on stage. If you can believe a politician was in charge of entertainment in those days. Not much has changed. He said, well, I'll tell you what, they'll be like Greco-Roman paintings. They won't move. So the comics used to go behind the flats and try and make the girls giggle or wobble, as they said. And Dad said it was 6 shows a day, 6 days a week, going on and off to the sound of his own feet. But he did an audition for Vivian Van Damme, asked if he had any more jokes, did a few more jokes. He said, have you got another song for us? He says, I do, but I don't have sheet music. And he said, well, the pianist will busk for you. So he did another song, and then it was sort of in an uncertain pause afterwards where I expected them to shout next. They said, dressing room 12A, you're on at 12:30. So he phoned his mum and said, I'm not coming home for tea. Wow. And I don't think he was going to be home for another 7 months' worth of teas after that. So that was his introduction to...
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then he went on to be the main scriptwriter for Danny LaRue's London nightclub. Now, here's amazing fact. He was spotted there by David Frost. And now we introduce you because, yes... in the 19th, he joined the writing team of Frost, didn't he?
Yeah.
And that's where he met.
On the Frost Report. Yeah.
On the Frost Report, which was sensational, trailblazing, and that is where he met the Monty Python guys, who weren't, of course, the Monty Python
No,
fans.
not then.
No.
Not then. And by the way, I wasn't with them then. I'm only 69. I started working with them in 1979, but obviously I've worked intimately with them. I haven't had a proper job. That's been my only career. And to this day, when I still manage Michael and still have to placate John. Indeed, that is the introduction. And before we go down that route, I just want to say my initial shock at being invited to be on this panel, given the fact that I didn't know Priestley when he met the Pythons, but I've heard of the encounter, and we'll come on to that, was... And let's bring Priestley back into it just for a second. Was last year I had the privilege of interviewing Stuart Maconie, who's a bit of a hero of mine, on stage, and he wrote an updated version of Priestley's English Journey. And if you look at that book, I recommend it to you. I recommend this book as well. The introduction or the dedication is that Barry Cryer had introduced Maconie to J.B. Priestley and triggered Maconie writing the full English, which is the version of the Priestley book of 1933. To go back to my mob, this is all secondhand, so you'll have to forgive me, and you can't sue me. I wasn't there. Then the Cambridge parts of the Monty Python team, so John Cleese and Graham Chapman and Eric Idle, particularly Cleese, had sort of already established themselves at the Edinburgh Fringe. So where Frost had seen them, Michael, the Oxford mob, Michael Palin and Terry Jones had gone up with a review also to Oxford. So that's where Frosty talent spotted what was to become the Pythons. And Michael, and my first real, chronologically, the first Barry story I hear, and I hear it all the time. I speak to Michael on a daily basis, obviously with my work. Michael said that Cleese and the Cambridge mob had done a bit of Beyond the Fringe, and they'd been to New York after Edinburgh. And so they were a bit more established and weren't very welcoming. This carries on to this day, the Oxford and Cambridge clash in the Python group. And they weren't very welcoming. And Michael and Terry went to a script meeting commissioned by Frost. And obviously, your dad was there. And Michael said that's where the friendship was formed. Barry just, took these two. There were a lot of in-crowd stuff, and there's a lot of competition in the world of comedy. And the nicest man in the room just made the second nicest man in show business, Michael Palin, feel comfortable. And it's a friendship that lasted for the rest of Barry's life. And I should say that my only first-hand experience of Barry, this session's all about him, was twofold and wasn't at all sort of show busy given the world I've moved in the last 45 years. I met him at Palin family gatherings. And Palin family gatherings, obviously no one knows this isn't public, weren't show busy. They were Michael's school friends. They were family, his late wife's family. They were university friends, the best man at his wedding. They were very unshow busy. You could go to a Michael's 40th birthday party, 50th, silver wedding anniversary, whatever it is, and you wouldn't go with your autograph book. But the one person famous that I saw there, and it's the only time I ever met Barry, one-on-one, would be at Palin family events. And it was weird. I mean, most of the Pythons didn't get invited to these things. They were very much about the friends of this.
Which I suppose was a compliment to Dad, because he didn't consider him show busy in
completely.
That sense.
Yeah. And then the only other time, which was a bit more public, was at Graham Chapman's funeral service in, that'd be 1989 or something like that, where Graham had written with your dad, and Barry must have been there and taken part in it. And I just remember it vividly because I won't be as polite as Lindsay, because John Cleese took the stage and said he wanted to be the first person to say fuck at a funeral and oration. And also, Graham made us, by projecting on a screen like that, sing, and again, this is so politically incorrect, I'm going to be closed down by the Lord Chamberlain of Bradford soon, made us sing Jerusalem with every L pronounced as an R and every R pronounced as an L, and it's embarrassing, and please, if there are any Japanese persons in the audience, don't take me round to the police station. So those are the only times I met him. But the rest, my only contribution to this hour is second-hand. But I just wanted to.
Well, as is mine. Let's be fair as well. But I come by it honestly.
Yeah. So
no, that memorial service, Dad remembers fondly, because John Cleese said, in tribute to Graham, having just sworn as he did, he said, "Anything but mindless good taste."
Yes.
Which I think was a lovely way of putting it.
I mean, Cleese just stood up and said, "Good riddance to, Graham Chapman's dead. Good riddance to the old fart. He was mean and this, that." It was just the antithesis, culminating with the F word of a sort of oration.
I remember Dad told me he went to a memorial service with Alan Simpson of Galton and Simpson fame. It was for Dennis Main Wilson, the great BBC radio and TV producer, Hancock producer for a long while as well. Everyone knew Alan as obviously a great wordsmith, but he also had quite a fruity turn of phrase, and he could tell low humour jokes and things. And they thought, well, that's probably what Dennis is going to get at the memorial. And Alan stood up and I forget the name of the poem, but "I'm not dead, I'm just in the other room," and all that kind of thing. It's very reverent and very sombre, and sort of caught everyone off guard, a little bit like I've just caught you all off guard just now. But you just sensed the chill. And he left a pause, turned, looked at the coffin and said, "I told you, Den, not a fucking laugh in it." It's the problem with memorial services and comedians, isn't it?
No, absolutely.
It is, yeah, absolutely. You hinted there, by the way, that Graham Chapman and Barry wrote together.
Yes, indeed.
50. And not everybody would put those two together.
No.
Other than David Frost.
Indeed.
Because he
Yeah.
observed them getting on well together.
Yeah.
Dad called him the practicing catalyst.
Yeah.
That's a very good expression about Frost, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, he was, if of all of his talents, many and varied, producing was probably the best of the lot because he was a great energy.
And he liked writing with a partner always, didn't he?
Yeah, Dad.
Barry,
Again,
John.
John. Well, yes, John and Dad tried to write together.
John Junkin.
Oh, John Junkin, I see. Sorry, not John Cleese. Yeah,
Not John Cleese.
No, with John Junkin, quite a bit of Morecambe and
Morecambe
Wise.
Wise, yeah.
John Junkin did a very good Eric. And often, when you're in a partnership and you're writing comedy, you're sounding stuff out. Eric would be walking up and down, played by John, with the pipe in mouth, another Priestley reference.
Yes, and Graham.
And then Dad, would play the part of Ernie Wise, which I guess, in terms of geography, was just about right as well. So, just down the road.
The Leeds boy, yeah. It's interesting that, isn't it? But I said, how did you get on with Morecambe and Wise? He said, Morecambe was more demanding.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but he said... I once wrote something that was a marvellous, I thought was marvellous. This is your dad.
Yeah.
And he said, no, won't do for me. No, that's it. And I was really morose about that. And I was in the bar afterwards. And Morecambe came in. He said, I now realise on purpose. Said, can I buy you a drink? Bought him a drink. And he said, well, you can, but it's not going to be much compensation for just turning down what I thought was a very good gag. He said, that was then, this is now. We move on. Yeah. You're still in the team. And that is very gracious, and he said, your dad said, I realised, yes, some you lose, some you win. And,
Dad's natural instinct was to have the white heat of the moment and move on. That was one of the reasons why he couldn't work with John Cleese when they wrote, is because John wanted to painstakingly go over every motivation and every rhythm of every line and just work things out. And Dad said, well, if we're not laughing, that used to be the thing at Python read-throughs, wasn't it?
Yeah.
If you don't laugh, it's not in.
No, and that's what brought out the competitive nature in Python read-throughs, because John and Graham would support their material they wrote together. Michael and Terry would support that. They'd all be falling out. The Oxford material didn't like the Cambridge material, and then poor Eric Idle, he had to defend much harder. And
on his own.
On his own,
Yeah, because he wrote on his own, didn't he?
He wrote on his own, yeah. And I was just thinking when you were talking about Cleese, I don't know whether it's of interest or if people know it, but when we did A Fish Called Wanda, John took 6 years to craft the script, working. And at the time, he was kind of famous. He'd done Fawlty Towers. He had this successful video arts company. He didn't need to, it would have been the easiest job in the world for me as the producer to pick up the phone and get some development money for him to write that. But he insisted on just not showing it to anybody, crafting every word, every nuance, and sent it to people he trusted. This is only relevant because your dad's primarily a writer. Everybody he trusted until he got it right. Yeah. He felt, and then... then...
And that is, obviously, I'm just comparing styles of comic writing.
But Cleese was obsessive. And
the results were borne out by that approach. And, there's a similarity with Eric Morecambe in that regard.
Yeah.
So you don't get that good by mistake. It is hard work and a lot of graft. And that's what Morecambe had as well. And Dad said, Dad worshipped Morecambe, and that was sort of a very easy pill to swallow, I think, and he always said when he and John Junkin were writing for Morecambe and Wise, which they came about largely because Eddie Braben, another grafter, worked himself into hospital on 2 occasions through just the sheer exhaustion. Again, someone who worked on his own largely, and Dad and John would step in for a couple of Christmas shows, the famous Christmas shows, and their very first series at Thames when they'd left the BBC. Dad always described themselves as the B team, which John Junkin hated. Because again, Dad, venerated Braben as well. He said the great Eddie Braben. As we'll come on, he venerated quite a lot of people, of which JB is probably at the top of the tree. So,
was it hard for you to sort of be in your father's shade, as it were, because he was such a luminary? And,
well, speaking of, you were saying about how that comment from Eric Morecambe, he was able to take, and how we've talked about the kind of organic, evolving nature of these relationships, and particularly professional ones in comedy, and how obviously the kindness and luck as he saw it, you know, throughout. He was dogged by good luck, Dad said, throughout his career. And I challenged him on that and said, Dad, you've got to be quite good to be in the right place at the right time and to take the opportunity. He said, I suppose if you weren't talented, you wouldn't be writing for David Frost in the first place. But that when he met Mike for the first time, he was passing on that sort of kindness and warmth that he'd experienced at the hands of people like David Nixon and Vivian Van Damme and everything else. But so this evolving sort of idea that you pay it forward from the experience you've had from other performers and writers got passed on to me at the Edinburgh Festival, back to that again, when I, in a bit of hubris, attempted for the first time in my life, because I consider myself as running away from the circus, to become, in my words, a straight actor. And Dad said, I've seen the way you walk, there's nothing straight about that. Is that we did me and a few friends at university decided to do a sketch show, and of course when Dad came in to watch it, all eyes were on him to see what they thought. And at the bar afterwards, again, there's another common link, I said, so Dad, what did you think? He said, well, he kept aiming at punchlines, but never quite hitting them. I took to be the kindest way of letting, it really wasn't a very good show, and we were quite aware of it when we were doing it. There were 7 of us, and very often we outnumbered the audience. But it was Dad's way of just saying, well, I have to say something, and I can't just say something bland like the suit was nice, because he'd already been through that with his mother. But I did write with Dad later on when I'd sort of got over the idea that this was something to be spurned. I probably got to know my dad better through writing with him than at any other time in my life, because I sort of saw him at his most authentic in that way. So I never felt particularly intimidated, because he wasn't an intimidating individual. So it wasn't, now listen, Spike, here are the 5 rules of comedy. Come into my office and, like Vivian Van Damme did, as Dad said, between the desk and the fish tank, to strip your act bare. So Dad was always very wary of that. So his sort of gentle put down of you kept aiming at punchlines but never quite hitting them, I took as his way of saying, maybe we should try something else. And whenever I pitched ideas to him, a bit like Eric Morecambe, he was very good at saying, oh, that's great, but, and it was just that. And I knew that just meant, all right, I'll go again. Because by his own example, screw up the paper, throw it in the bin, start again. And that's a very healthy way of looking at the creative process, and I'm very indebted to him for that kind of, it's not even tough love really, but it's just a very pragmatic, common sense, approach to the business, because 99% of it is rejection, whether you're an actor or whether you're a writer, producer, it is about being told no 99 times until you get the one yes that actually pays your mortgage. So this idea of the sort of the garret with the tortured romantic soul was, albeit for the lifestyle, Dad quite liked that lifestyle. We said, I never described myself as a Yorkshireman, I just had a bedsit mentality to life. I just needed a train station, some beer in the fridge, a pub, something to write on, and a copy of the Evening Standard, which, that might have been considered the luxury in the list for Dad.
No, it's interesting that Priestley. I met Priestley, interviewed him, and I'll tell you about it later. What the precocious 2 questions I asked him, but I said, "Do you wait for the muse? Do you wait for the creativity to come?" He said, "Listen, lad, this is an office job. I start at 9 o'clock and I finish at 1, and I'm on my own, and I'm not interfered with." Mind you, he had the luxury of, gardener, chauffeur, maid, so let's not pretend that he was doing all those things. Then he had lunch, then a walk, short walk, and then back down, and not up again until 5.
Yeah.
So it was discipline.
Yeah.
And
Mike Palin's got that kind of discipline, hasn't he?
Yeah,
well?
we speak most days, and I don't phone him before 9:30, not because he's having a line, but every day since 1969 he's written up his diary. And that's what he tends to do.
And he used to go for a run before
and
that
he used
as well.
to, yeah. He's had heart issues the last few years,
yeah.
But yeah, he was on the heath. And,
was it Priestley? I remember that too. He said that that's the difference between an amateur and a professional writer. It's the very simple truth is you get up and write on the mornings when you don't want to.
Yeah. Oh, and Michael, I tease him. He's just delivered his latest book, and he's always early. So for publishers, I said,
They
Michael,
don't know what to do. Yeah.
he's my only sort of client. So these publishers who I've done deals for Michael for, just, never had to shout at me, get your guy's in default again, He's
always on.
so bloody disciplined.
Yeah.
But I want to go back a little bit, because it is a cutthroat and competitive world in which your dad and at the fringes I've moved in and Lindsay has. But people don't always pay it forward. And that's what I want to really say, that, my contribution about your dad is that even in the last week, now I'm going to sound like a name-dropping posh southerner that's betrayed his roots, but in the last week, quite accidentally, I met two public figures, and I just floated, because I was coming here today, I just floated the name Barry Cryer. And they're an unlikely couple. One, you've had a spoiler, Miriam Margolis, who I had a lovely chat with. I've met her a few times over the years, and we kind of get along politically and so on, and have lots of people in common. So yesterday, quite naively, I said, what about Barry Cryer? Oh, I miss him. As she said, Barry would phone me every birthday, without fail, tell me a joke. And this, I just keep hearing. It's like the world, your dad just was endlessly on the telephone, because obviously the Pythons have told that to me. But then this is bizarre. Last Tuesday, and I promise you I don't have a glamorous social life these days in my anecdotage, I was with John Cooper Clarke, and having dinner before he did a gig at the Reading Town Hall. And I don't know why, maybe we'd run out of things to... I said, John, you didn't ever meet Barry Cryer? And he just, I won't try and do the Salford nasal accent, he just said, every birthday, Barry Cryer would ring me up and tell me a joke, and I do miss it. I mean, it's like they're pretty unlikely bedfellows, aren't they, Miriam Margolis and John Cooper Clarke?
Dad really missed his vocation. He should have been in telemarketing.
Absolutely amazing. And I think, I'm not trying to elevate Palin to a kind of higher level, but it was more than Michael's birthday that your dad called. Often, since we gave up our office, often I see Michael he has an office at home, and we'll be sort of chatting and say, I just had Barry on the call.
Yeah.
And I know it wasn't his birthday, because I can remember Michael's birthday.
It's just whenever a joke... There was a new joke, Dad would phone a certain,
Yeah, and Michael was on that list. But really, I don't want people who aren't in this ridiculous milieu to assume that everybody's sort of kind to people that have been kind to them on the way up, are sort of kind to the next generation. There's a lot of competition, a lot of cutthroat, and a lot of backbiting. And I think Barry was up there, top of the Premier League. I think, Michael's pretty much Premier League in that. But most people are just don't like it.
I mean,
They're jealous.
pick up the names as you find them, but Stephen Fry at Dad's memorial said, comedians by nature are a very vain, venal,
absolutely
poisonous
really
bunch.
Competitive.
And I mean, he was, obviously then went on to eulogize some other, luminaries as well. But he said, but Barry Cryer was, and it is worth remembering. And I think, obviously I'm biased, but I come by it honestly. It is worth remembering that that's not a natural thing, but I think it was for Dad. He always talk in the book about how losing his own father, aged 5, my dad was 5, not his father, was something that Dad, and again this sort of trying to chase the twinkle in his mother's eye as a comedian. He said he spoke to, again, sorry for doing it as well, but Bob Mortimer lost his father quite young, and he said for quite a lot of my life, I needed reassurance from somebody, because I didn't have a father figure, and I chose other people, and I chose audiences, and that's why Dad wrote in a partnership as well, because he needed that sort of comfort of having a voice in the room, because he never knew, he said, if you could have played me a tape of my father speaking, I wouldn't have recognized it. So he was always chasing that, and I think Graham Garden said, Barry needs an audience, and Dad said, no, I need people. And I said, I'm a peopleaholic. And I'm terminally gregarious, he said, and that kind of thing. So that's what he was seeking as well. But he saw in comedy an opportunity for the most obvious. I was about to say. I do apologise. Shall I take that again? Here we go. I was about to say with the noise from an audience, but then. But the instant response of laughter, and Dad had this thing where he loved to hear laughter, but he didn't always have to be the one making it. Usually he was the one laughing himself. And that's, if any Clue fans are in, that's been the one thing that people always say to me that they miss about the show now is not the quality, that's still there, and the silliness, that's still there, but I just miss your father's laugh on that show. But, you know, Milton Jones, again, at Dad's memorial, said he was very generous and he loved to laugh at other people's jokes. How I envy him, doing that, and I wish he was here now.
Yeah, that's a refrain we've heard a lot, isn't it? Yeah. Right, I'm intrigued as to how your father became a devotee of J.B. Priestley. I mean, he told me once he was in a bookshop in Penzance.
Yes.
And saw a book and took it, and that really solidified it. I suspect he knew about him earlier as a young man.
I think, like any of that generation, I mean, Dad was born in 1935, so would have been, perhaps too young to get the implication of what Priestley was saying in his postscripts during the war, but certainly that voice would have been recognisable, certainly to a young Yorkshire lad who, by all accounts, invented a forerunner of the iPhone, because he used to haul up the Bakelite radio up to his bedroom in Mount Pleasant Avenue. And he would actually, I think that's another sort of thing that Mike Palin shared, is that they were glued to the radio, and it didn't matter what it was. So these days when, I've got teenage daughters, so what they're doing, they're on their phones in their room. I said, well, my dad was doing exactly the same thing on his radio, listening probably to J.B. broadcasts.
Yeah, possibly in the war.
He said, I'd always sort of fought shy of his reputation as a novelist, and I obviously knew about, the sort of most popular novel, Good Companions, and that was that was my gateway drug. That was the one that, it ruined the holiday for us as a family, but he just found himself voraciously chewing through that for a few days. When he said he sort of bit the bullet and did that. But shall I talk about their first
that's
meeting?
what I was teeing up, if you can. Yeah, please do. It is... I know that Graham Chapman got very fed up of him going on about J.B. Priestley.
He said, you're a bore on the subject of Priestley.
Yeah, and he said, this guy was, steeped in Edward. He was born in 1894. He's steeped in Edwardian era, and can't we get out of that? Because it was the antithesis in appearance.
Yeah, very Graham, that, wouldn't it be, to sort of rail at sort of an establishment figure? J.B. wouldn't have seen himself as an establishment figure, but...
No, he wouldn't.
No.
There was a radicalism in him.
Yeah.
But the other side...
But he was from a different generation. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. But your dad defended him.
Yeah. Well, that's a common thing, isn't it? That Dad never saw the generations as being markers in the sand. It's like, he said, you're either funny or you're not. Said Arthur Askey had said that to him once, that every generation's the same with comedians. There's a lot of crap, but there's some good ones as well. And I think that's sort of latterly when there was the alternative scene in the 80s, and they've a lot of that crowd, Ben Elton and Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie, have said the same thing about Dad. Is that where there were a lot of, I won't mention names, but there were sort of blazered golfing comedians who decided that this was a form of comedy that was to be resisted at all costs. Dad was the one that, they were stitched up on a Pebble Mill program once, where they pitted the sort of the old guard against the alternatives. And like a lot of Dad's stories, and go with me on this one when I say a lot of stories are set in gentlemen's toilets. Is that some of the best lines he's heard have come from gentlemen's toilets, but is that him and Ben Elton, before the recording, were in there, they're sort of talking to each other saying, they're trying to stitch us up, aren't they? They want us to go, a bit like the Today programme does, the antithetical thing. We've got someone to defend and someone to prosecute and let them have at it, but they completely screwed things up for Central Television because they just said, well, let's just talk about our heroes. And of course, Max Miller is a great hero of Ben Elton's, and Dad would work with him, and et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, he didn't see the same kind of divisions, and so Priestley would have been an immediacy for Dad to go to. He just heard the characters and the storytelling.
And the writing.
And the writing,
yeah.
Exactly.
So let's get on to the crucial thing.
Shall I sing for my supper?
Yes. So this is how the unlikely scenario of Cryer getting in touch with Priestley and effectively being the gateway for the Monty Pythons to meet Priestley, and then for him, Cryer and Priestley, to become bosom buddies for the rest of their life.
So Dad and Graham Chapman had been writing Doctor in the House variously at Graham's house in Highgate, and then more latterly in the Angel pub in the High Street. which Dad actually said that, Graham was a spirit drinker. I mean,
He was.
I
mean, I
you
heard.
didn't know him then, but Dad used to show up at 10 o'clock in the morning. He was there with Marty Feldman with a martini in his hand.
Yeah.
And it said, actually, it was a rare example in my career where going to the pub was seen as the benevolent option for Graham, because then he could drink pints.
Yeah.
And actually, he said, we got so much more work done, admittedly, an hour and a half, but that's, for any comedy writers out there, that's still golden to get that out of Graham. And then, the rest of the afternoon would unfold with an appearance by Keith Moon or Douglas Adams, actually, was in his early days. Anyway, that's enough names. Name drops keep falling on my head, etc. So we do start with Graham Chapman. Perhaps Graham's greatest legacy for Dad, aside from the work they generated, was the instrumental part Chapman played in starting Dad's friendship with the Yorkshire literary titan, J.B. Priestley. Dad revered him and would let anyone who would listen know about his love for the man he called the great J.B. Dad and Graham were having lunch one day, and Graham said, you're a bit of a bore on the subject of J.B. Priestley. Why don't you ring him? Dad was stumped by this logic and blustered at the idea. But Chapman persisted. Dad then remembered a woman at Yorkshire Television who made a documentary with J.B., and before he knew it, he was calling the Priestley home. A woman answered the phone, who Dad later found out was the housekeeper, and, with Graham at his side, said, "Is Mr. Priestley in?" There was a short period of silence, and then a very familiar voice said, "Hello?" I won't do the voice. "Hello? Who's that?" Dad stuttered. "My name is, Barry Cryer." "Are you indeed? I've heard you on the wireless," said J.B. Dad's confidence soared, and suitably emboldened, asked if they could meet for tea. "You're mad," came the unexpected response, but Priestley consented. "I'll have you know I'm giving up my walk," he said. Dad then asked if his friend could join them. "Who's your mate?" said the great man. It turned out that not only was J.B. a big fan of Monty Python, but he knew they were doing their very first stage show at the Belgrade Theatre in Coventry the following week. The Priestleys lived in Ulverston, just outside Stratford-upon-Avon, which is about half an hour away. J.B. had even been infuriated that the BBC had stopped showing Flying Circus in the Midlands. It didn't take too long before other Pythons heard about the plan, and the following week, John Cleese, Michael Palin, and Graham's partner David Sherlock were all packed into a car heading to Priestley's home, Kissing Tree House. After an initial mix-up that saw the Priestley housekeeper encountering a kneeling Michael Palin, who was checking the letterbox for signs of life, Priestley eventually greeted them warmly at the door, and although he looked pleased to see them, the atmosphere was a little stilted at first. It turned out Priestley was just as nervous as they were. Graham took out his pipe and started filling it. Priestley did the same, and the two men began comparing their tobacco. The afternoon shifted into an easy camaraderie that encouraged Priestley's wife, Jaquetta, to emerge from behind a bookcase to join them. Apparently, she'd been hiding there because she thought it might be This Is Your Life. Dad became friends with the Yorkshire writer after that and used to take him regularly to the Café Royal for lunch. They stayed in touch until Priestley's death in 1984. To most of Dad's peers, Pythons excluded, J.B. Priestley was a creature from a bygone age. But Dad was always quick to champion his relevance, believing that good comedy and good writing transcended generations. Of writing generally, Priestley knew there were plenty of clever young writers, but wondered if there was too much genius, but not enough talent. As a result, Dad was never comfortable with comedy that was trying to be too clever, tricksy, or ornate. It was a turn-off. Rather, it was a well-crafted silliness based on years of hard work that appealed to him most.
Excellent stuff. Nicely written as well, don't you think? Yeah, that's really good. That's quite an insight, isn't it? Because he took away something from that in a big way about, don't try to be too tricksy and too clever by half. What's your recollection?
Well, it's been, obviously none of it's first-hand.
No.
And I think in his anecdotes, John Cleese has merged two different things. I had a dinner with him a couple of weeks ago and said I was doing this. And John's recollection is that they had this meeting. They were blown away. It may have been a follow-up, but it was very much a dinner. John had warm memories of it and was as amazed as the rest of the Pythons that J.B. Priestley was a fan. But then he said, this is John's recollection, and as I say, he's 84 and doddery. He said the evening came to an abrupt end when Graham, who obviously was drinking at that time, in the middle of the dinner, towards the end of the dinner, but brought about the end of the dinner by telling the table of his two rats, one called JB and the other called Jaquetta, at which Priestley said, "That's it." Well, I mean, it wasn't a row. Now, John, is maybe not remembering very well, and the sad thing is that we lost Gray in 1989. I haven't seen David for a couple of years. He hasn't been well of late. This is Graham Chapman's husband. So I can't give you, I never discussed this with Gray. And it was a different Gray from the one I knew. Graham was dry for the last 10 years of his life, and I started working with him during that period. And I knew him as a really talented, smart writer. You've got the essence of him by phone him up, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And he would confront things in a very matter-of-fact way, but a lovely man.
Because that's a similar kind of not brooking deference.
Absolutely.
In a way,
Absolutely.
just coming at it from a different angle.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, that John's recollection, and Dad probably would have tuned out any sort of sense of confrontation.
But you see, Graham clearly had many encounters with JB. The other Pythons didn't. Michael only recalls that first sort of get.
In many respects, Michael's a better fit for it, given his subsequent writings and everything else, because it seems like he's from a similar tradition as JB.
Yeah.
It's amazing that they didn't sort of meet more. Maybe John's recollection is a north-south thing as well,
it could be.
About the fact Dad called it tea and John's from Western-super-Mare and he called it dinner. So maybe it's that as well.
Yeah. Well, there's a north-south and this Oxford-Cambridge thing that still goes on to this day. They're at each other, and they use me, and I'm biased. I went to Cambridge. They use me as a kind of punch bag. Even Michael in the last couple of weeks. It's
like Kramer versus Kramer.
Yeah, exactly. He's having
You're
a go,
stuck
particularly Eric. It's like, oh, Steve, it's John was misbehaving, Eric was misbehaving. Cambridge. I said, remember which side I'm on. And then John the same.
And this is before you even bring Gillingham into it. So
don't start.
Another one.
Don't start. So anyway.
No, it's quite interesting, isn't it? So Graham could be provocative for the sake of it.
Oh, and that's what Dad loved. Graham was the sort of inner voice that Dad, daren't utter, because they obviously were great writing partners, but social friends as well. So they went to a dinner at the Dorchester, where they had a barker calling out the names. I don't know, the classic sort of thing. At the top of the stairs, in the old days, you'd sort of hand your card in, and then he'd read out your several titles and double-barreled names and all that, who you were there, what business you were there on behalf of, and which Saudi prince you were being paid by, that sort of thing. But they hadn't got a card for the barker, and Graham whispered in the barker's ear before Dad and he were about to appear, and they immediately locked arms, and the barker said, "Mr. Harry Belafonte and Mrs. Enoch Powell." So it was that kind of thing, and
That's so Graham.
Yeah.
And very original, isn't it? Very creative. Yeah. But that's amazing, isn't it? It's very interesting you say that, about I wasn't provoked. When I met Priestley, I was a precocious young reporter, and I beat a path to his door and wrote a letter and went to Kissing Tree House, and he was quite gruff in his, quite Yorkshire blunt. And but I was very Yorkshire in those days, a professional Yorkshireman almost, And I said to we got on okay, but it was the same panelled room, and Jaquetta appeared from nowhere. They had a secret compartment.
Yeah.
And she appeared, and she was happy that I was not being deliberately provocative, but she went away, and then I asked her two big questions, right, which she didn't like, and I said, because he'd been extolling the virtues of Wharfdale and Yockhamthwaite and Hubberholme, where he's buried, and the George Hotel and Bradford of his youth, and all the formative stuff, and Edwardian and the disparity of wealth, and we got on famously. And then I said, well, if you loved Yorkshire so much, why did you bugger off?
I get that all the time.
Yeah, and he said, I was a bit provocative and not really thoughtful, because he said, now listen, lad, which is the put down. I had to go. London was where the action was. London was where the publishers were. There was no Yorkshire TV in those days, or Granada. He said, I had to go to London, so stuff that in your pipe and smoke it. Yeah, and of course he's right. You know, I realised that, and it's a good lesson for the...
At least he split the difference, though.
Yes.
In Warwickshire. You know.
Yes, indeed. Oh, he once said, Barry once said, I said, where did Bob go to university? He said, Warwick. Alas, poor Warwick. Good lines. Good
Brilliant,
lines. Yeah.
brilliant.
Yeah. The second thing was with Priestley, the question. I said, Orwell went and lived with the miners in Wigan and Sheffield and Leeds, actually, with the workers. And he said, I said, you went round in a chauffeur-driven Daimler car.
And
why?
Orwell went to Eton.
Yeah. Oh, I know. The contrasts are incredible. Yeah. I trust Priestley's instincts on this. I said, so why did you go in a Daimler car? He said, because, lad, I could afford it. And which is a great one. And then he said, but look at the book. Read the book. You tell me where that's affected what I saw and what I wrote. And he's right, because that shifted me seminally when I was a young man, when I read English Journey at Bradford City Library. It shifted me massively, you know, and so that's when he became a bit of a hero. But it's a very good answer.
Yeah.
You know, forthright, not self-conscious.
It's all in the writing.
Yeah, it's all in the writing and the perception and the looking at things and observing. So I think that's it. Now, are you asking us to wind up?
I am indeed.
Yeah.
Gosh, look at that.
Yeah, I know. Have we got to wind up? Yeah, we do. Right,
is
we
it
have
after?
other things.
I
right.
don't wear a watch.
Well, I think we've covered the widespread gamut. There were a couple of tales I wanted to get out, but we haven't done.
I think we're up to about 1969, so, you know,
Yeah.
come back in a week. Yeah.
But I would, you know, that has not been disappointing at all for me, personally, with these two rascals. So I'd like you to give them a round of applause. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe, share this episode with others and leave a rating. Mark your calendars for the return of Bradford Literature Festival on Friday the 27th of June to Sunday the 6th of July 2025.